I mean, with
streaming.
the AI, you will literally be able, seems like you're gonna just be able to make like direct your own movie, just tell it what movie to make.
Yeah,
So
do you
that's
think that's
definitely
where I was thinking about that? Do you think that AI is going to get to the point where basically like the average Joe who has hardly any finances could literally like with CGI be able to create a blockbuster rendition, like on a
yeah,
level of some kind of a Marvel film or something, and do it for pennies because of the power of I mean that would be
that'd
incredible
be
as to what
fascinating.
that would do for art. My God, Today's Things Hidden podcast, we have a guest who is someone who also writes and does programming and podcasts on the topic of mimetic theory and Rene Girard and applying it to various issues. He is an economist and teacher in China. George Boreas joins us. How you doing, George?
Doing very well. Thanks for having me, David.
Thank you. How long have you been living in Asia?
Man, a total of 11 years. I did a
Wow.
stint in South Korea back in the day. Then I came back to Canada, where I grew up. And then I came back, and this is my ninth year in Shanghai, China.
That's fantastic. And
A
how,
long-term expat.
And what brought you to China? Are you fascinated with the culture? Does that where how did you end up here?
It wasn't the culture, or political reasons. You meet people like that, but I wasn't one of them. I was fresh out of business school in 2015. I was looking for business opportunities. And that year, everybody was talking about China's going to blow up. China's going to blow up. So I came here with some business ideas. I was doing that for a while. And just, personal reasons, starting, turning a new page in life. And, Shanghai community here, there's a big expat community. So I live in an expat kind of part of town, and I mean, I don't speak, I speak survival Chinese, but most of my life and work is within, English speaking community.
Oh, very good. So you came originally from Canada, correct? That's where you're from originally.
Yeah, Toronto, Canada.
Wow.
Um,
So
my
what's
family's from, as I said, I was born in Serbia. My family immigrated there when I was 13. So I would spend my childhood in Serbia and uh, the rest of my growing up in Canada
so who has
area.
more freedom, Canada or China?
Um, Good question. This question comes up a lot. You can definitely hear a lot of horror stories, let's call them, from especially back in the day, from people trying to do big things here. Um, I say I live in like a bubble here. I don't wheel and deal with big power brokers here. So within my own community, a little expat community, of course, a lot of Chinese friends as well. I don't feel like my community, like my freedom is seriously restrained. I do my little podcasts on like, foreign internet. Nobody bothers me. Um, well, there'd be nobody to listen to my stuff or read it in China anyway. But the media stuff I do is kind of outside of China, and I don't think they care about that. But day to day, yeah, I mean, it's not like I meddle in Chinese politics. I wouldn't do that. If I did that, who knows what would happen, right? But it's just not something I meddle in. As
Yeah,
far as my kind of interests and lifestyle goes, I think it's pretty cool here.
I'm curious what the Chinese society, Chinese government, and even Japan, what they would think of mimetic theory and Rene Girard. Would they consider it to be a troublesome concept that they wouldn't want, being widely thought about in their societies, or would they just find it to be too bizarre and peculiar and wouldn't, take in their society, not enough Christian influence in the soil of their society to really have much of an appeal to that theory? I'm curious.
I haven't really talked about people here about mimetic theory, except my friends. I don't see any of it in media. As I said, I don't read Chinese media. I just can't read Chinese. But
Mhm.
I had one story where I was communicating with a professor in US. For a while, I was trying to kind of get a go the academic route, maybe do some PhD in Girard. And this professor pointed out to me a Chinese scholar who was a Girard scholar. And that was the only example of a Girard scholar I heard of in China. And this person I remember was, like in a big respectable university, publishing big respectable paper. He was researching Girard. Of course, he wouldn't be Christian about it. I'm guessing he probably does mention the Christian connection, but I also noticed that he kind of, instead of saying, "Oh, Girard explains human culture," he was saying kind of Girard explains Western culture. So he wasn't at least officially saying something like this also explains us, but applied to the West,
Yeah.
that's he's genius. He's brilliant. He explains everything, right? So you see that typically in China. I think people here are sensitive about self-analyzing, but they actually quite love to, I think, look at the Western culture, look outside of their country and engage in those kind of studies.
And I know that I think Peter Thiel's book, Zero to One, which is an applied use of mimetic theory for startups and business practices and management, I think was a big seller in China, a couple million copies sold. So, that was a way in which maybe the entrepreneurial world of China engaged in mimetic theory in an applied way. Interesting.
Yeah, yeah, that didn't occur to me, but I think I've heard that somewhere. There's definitely a big startup spirit here too, just like in US, there's a lot of quite obvious competition between US and China in the tech sector and just innovative sector, not necessarily in a bad way. I mean, there's obviously a dark side to it, as we know from Gerard, but just kind of wholesome, positivity about the future, about technological development here. There's a lot of optimism, and I think Chinese are very open to new business idea, new business takes, and and the business environment would be a politically safe environment to explore those ideas. So just like you said, I think that 0 to 1 Peter Thiel kind of thing would be something they would definitely be very interested to engage in.
Yeah. No, one of the things we talked about before we did this program, we talked about the concept of the Katechon and how this works in history, the restrainer. Maybe we could use that as kind of a launch point into how you see mimetic theory helping us understand current events. This is something that's talked about a lot within some circles who are familiar with mimetic theory about what is it that is the restrainer, what is the force that is kind of holding us back from devolving into chaos and runaway imitative violence, tit for tat feuding, as we can call it, runaway negative mimesis. You have to have a restrainer, is this concept. So, would you explain a little bit from your perspective how that works in your worldview?
Sure. I mean, I love that topic. I think it's very deep and ties in a lot of things. We started off talking about libertarians, right, and how their heart is sort of in the right place, but uh, a society without government is almost it's a contradiction in terms because you need that protective element of the state. But it's also a Christian kind of spirit where as Christians, we think about kingdom of heaven and whatnot, and there's always this kind of position or tension between Christianity and the state. And I think that's where Catechon comes in. Um, the term dates to St. Paul's letter. I think it was, I forgot which one it was, but it's a Greek word meaning just the restrainer, that which restrains. So in that initial context, the idea was that lawlessness is coming, and that lawlessness is interpreted as the Antichrist at the end of times. But what's restraining the lawlessness and what's restraining the Antichrist is um, is the catechon. And I forget if St. Paul mentions it or there's been a lot of commentary throughout history as to what this catechon is. It was implied to be some sort of earthly power, right? I think in a lot of interpretations has been the Roman state of the time. So there's this basic idea that as the sort of Christian idea spreads, as it opens us up to the truth of our violence and the truth, the arbitrariness of our systems, those systems will become, well, unraveled, and that opens up the opportunity to that final lawlessness to come in. But the time has not yet come, right? And there has to be that restrainer, even though it might not be, it might have some violence. It does come at a cost of blood and injustice and so on. But it has to be there. Okay, and
So do you see the
um,
restrainer? This comes from the Second Thessalonians. Do you see that
right.
this uh, restrainer called the Katechon is something that happened in history relevant to the time in which the letter to the Thessalonians was written by Paul, or do you see it as a kind of recurring concept that is going to be like through all times a force, that we're going through with history, or both?
Uh, Both, more of the second, but like each time has its own catacon. But the idea is that due to Christian influence upon humanity, or that
Yeah,
Girardian revelation of the victory mechanism, um, there's a double-edged sword there, right? And on one hand, what that revelation is doing, it's making us more and more aware of our violence of our systems, right? And that's the good thing, right? But on the other hand, by revealing the violence of our system, it's discrediting our systems.
right,
So the idea is this very kind of complex idea of the revelation doing both very good and very bad things at the same time. Yes, we're being aware of the arbitrary violence, but like Girard says, right, once we're aware of that innocence of the victim, we're kind of left naked. How are we supposed to establish order right now? So in that kind of Christian reading, Katechon was always there, and it used to be very, very strong. And it still is, I would say, in my view, there's still Katechon heavy cultures. Those would be traditional cultures, like China might be Katechon heavy, or Islamic countries, right? Because they are rule of law countries, right? Whereas as we progress more and more towards this Christian thing, that's why liberalism happens in Christian societies. Um, there's this kind of idea that the systems are um, have this inherent violence in them. Ideally, we want to overcome that violence of the systems and achieve some higher, right, a kingdom of love, kingdom of heaven. But as we step towards that way of stepping away from the violence, we expose ourselves to the risk of not being protected by that violent state and violent law, and ushering in, the apocalypse, the Antichrist. And I think this works into the theology. Why does Antichrist have to come right before Christ? Because when you disband that catechon, first thing that before happiness, first thing before kingdom of heaven can come, there has to be that chaos of unrestricted violence. That's technically, like, I'm not that expert in the field, but that's the basic idea, and I think it ties in Girard with a lot of this
yeah.
theology.
And I think it's a discussion that needs to be further developed and had, because I see uh the catechon in some ways as, I mean, the way people describe the catechon, I don't know if this is necessarily Paul's intention here, but I see the catechon as kind of like synonymous with the elements of, what we would call pagan sacrificial hierarchy. You know what I mean? And to the extent that
Yeah,
a society maintains a kind of pagan sacrificial hierarchy, it has elements of that restraining element on the power of mimetic competition going out of control, right? But the problem is, the paradox is that the more one, you know, I don't think that the revelation of the gospel is necessarily something that is ambiguous in terms of providing good and bad. I think the bad that comes from the revelation is to the extent to which human beings refuse to follow and repent, right? To the extent that they encounter the revelation, that's what I call Christ hauntedness. To the extent that
right.
we become a Christ haunted nation, but are in rebellion to the implications of the call of the gospel, it produces bad effects of being exposed to the revelation, right? So it's kind of a paradoxical thing. You know, on the one hand, people believe you need these strong structures like government and institutions around it to kind of hold back insane, undifferentiated chaos. But on the other hand, they're the very oftentimes the engine of further chaos. You know, I mean, you look at what, you know, and Peter Thiel's talked about this recently in some of his interviews where he's talked about, you know, I've seen him, I've watched him, you know, he was kind of libertarian, you know, in his origin, and then he moved to more around the time of Trump's ascendance. He kind of moved into a more nationalistic, more, you know, old, you know, traditional right wing angle of top down right wing politics, and then almost associated with his apparent dissatisfaction with the results of trying it that way, having had some influence to some degree in the Trump administration. It seems as if he has become more disillusioned and swung back to the more libertarian side of his impulse. And he has indicated that, you know, perhaps this and this attempt to hold back chaos in the form of having global government is itself a chaotic element of society. They, you know, they try to this concept of anarcho tyranny. You know, this notion of trying to like use a Christ haunted way of dealing with order inevitably will backfire and create more schism and more disunity every time it's tried. And it's almost like once you get infected with the gospel, a society, the more it tries to impose sacrificial violence in that infection, the more it entangles it in a kind of disarray. You know, so it's almost like you have to push through the chaos rather than trying to reestablish older forms of sacrificial violence amidst the increasing awareness of
Yes,
the
yeah,
of its problem, right? And
yeah.
it's
I like the Christ haunted term, by the way. But yeah, I hear you. I think so. There's this idea of cycles of history in previous era where I mean I totally agree the idea that to the extent that humans that we as a society mess up is the extent to which we need a stronger, more violent, more sacrificial catechon, right? And history used to kind of go in these cycles where, you know, as a society becomes decadent, becomes depraved, to keep things together, the state needs to get more violent. But now, after the revelation, you know, we kind of have and Girard talks about this a lot, as I'm sure you're aware, the kind of like one directionality of history where there's no going back.
right.
So yes, there's an escalation, and I would link your expression "Christ haunted world" to the Girard. There's one thing Girard says that really stuck with me. It was in an interview, and he talked about how he was correcting himself, and he used to make a distinction between sacrificial and non-sacrificial Christianity, saying how all the bad historical Christianity was sacrificial, where they burnt the witches and so on. But the non-sacrificial Christianity is not just the one that doesn't prosecute victims, but kind of just becomes very rational, you know. And I think we live in this kind of non-sacrificial world. Modernity is really a big non-sacrificial space. Girard ends up saying there's no such thing as non-sacrificial space. But to your point, you know, this modern and postmodern thing, maybe young Peter Thiel too, there's this hope that, you know, we can just do away with any sort of sacrifice, good or bad, right? We can just be rational. We can just do without any sense of the sacred. And really that leads you to the conclusion of libertarianism, right? Just let everybody be free. Everybody's going to be happy. But then you realize then that human nature comes in and you realize that, you know, if you just have no control over anything, things tend to fall apart. You know, you don't get the kingdom of heaven, you kind of get the woke stuff, right? Where everybody's, yes, everybody's free. So now everybody thinks they're the 70th gender kind of thing. And I think that's what's drawing a lot of people. You know, we hear the trend how a lot of people are sorry, a lot of people used to be secular. They're saying, "Oh, we need to go back to the religion. Religion is good." It's this realization that, you know, you need some kind of a power. You can choose if you want it to be violent or you're loving God or loving sacred, right? But you need something, right? You can't have a non-sacrificial space. You can't have a God-haunted or
Right.
Christ-haunted world.
And there's two types of sacrifice, that Gerard identifies: the self-sacrifice, the self-giving of Christ, and then the sacrifice of another, the cultic sacrifice, the tribute to a
Right.
god, using your child or your goat or whatever, versus self-giving, self-emptying
Sure.
sacrifice. And I think that the movement of history is going to require, if we don't want to end up in chaos, is a kind of self-sacrifice of our romantic notion of the self, our
Right.
self-sacrifice of our ambitions to mimetically overcome our rivals. And that is the catechon, perhaps, is the kind of return of the belief in the in the reality of Christ as king. That perhaps, and I know this is a little bit, we're kind of just speculating about how these things map out into our current events, but I am of the belief that perhaps the catechon is more about just having the ability to have healthy differentiation, whether that's in the form of private property or contract, which requires trust, and it requires a certain level of civility to have contract. If you have a breakdown in civil order and nations where they can't trust each other, you don't have legitimate contracts. You don't have legitimate means of dealing with contract disputes. It just turns into violence, right? That's what a black market ends up, right? If you're outlawed, if the action that you're trying to provide or the good or service you're trying to provide is outlawed, then you don't have a means of disputation, of going to a court and saying, hey, you promised me this amount of goods and you didn't provide it, and I want to provide a lawsuit against you and have it handled civilly. You don't have access to that if you're in a market that is outlawed. And so therefore you're returned to violence, right? You have a dispute between rival gangs, they take it out through violence. Wait a second, you stiff me for the drugs, I shoot you and kill you, or you know what I mean? There's violence. And so I think that contract and private property and other forms of healthy differentiation could be together what might be the catechon. And that might, look like a different type of governance than what we have today. But I think the idea that public governance, the idea that the government is publicly owned, and that includes democracy, I think that as a form of restrainer is falling apart, right? That's kind of where I'm
Yeah.
getting at, is that um I'm not making a libertarian argument for like some kind of abstract attack against the state in absolute immediately, but rather, once societies start to consider government and its power to be publicly owned, and therefore kind of, every person has a say, it creates in itself a state of undifferentiation. For example, this use the example of protesters, like at the Charlottesville thing. Remember that
Uh-huh.
whole thing? There was a lot of
Yeah.
people that said, "Hey, how dare my tax dollars be used for a park in which people can come to that park having a right to protest and say such things that I find abominable." And yet so to me, that's a state of what I call consecrated undifferentiation. You don't have any ability to distinguish and say, hey, wait a second, the right of refusal, you're not allowed to be on this park. They can say, well, yes, we do. We contributed in taxes too. We're part of the public. Who's to claim who gets to walk on this park and make their expressions? Ultimately, the public governance model creates a kind of state of undifferentiation, which is going to inevitably result in chaos and schism and rivalry and a breakdown like what we're seeing today, where things just devolve back into mob violence.
Yeah, I mean, the private property rights and these private, all kinds of rights. I think that's definitely part of catechon or just law. And those things always function on the sense of the sacred. Um, from my reading of Girard, if you just talk about the most basic anthropology, anthropological cultures, they didn't have, Girard writes, they didn't have a rule of law or police. They didn't have police enforcement, right? Say, because they didn't have this kind of state that could enforce the rules, they had to rely on a sense of sacred. So, early on, humans were just terrified to break the rules, not because they're going to get arrested by the police. There was no police, but because it was deeply conditioned in them that once you start breaking the rules, chaos ensues, right? So it's the most basic
And
thing before Christian.
it's
Yeah,
felt as the wrath of the gods, rather something is
exactly.
disturbing the spirit of our culture, there's the spirits are angry, and that's why people are acting weird when we break the rules, right?
For sure, as we as very civilized, thousands of years later, we like if you're just like a decent functional person, you might not think of it as the sacred, right? Because we take it for granted now. Like I wouldn't think of like breaking somebody's window or stealing somebody's like random private property, but it's just something that's been conditioned. I fear it. I fear doing that, even if there's no police. I don't want to invite that wrath upon myself, right? But once that sense of the sacred or common decency disappears, and that's something that's very strong in every civilized country, including China. Once that disappears, the boundaries melt away, and everybody feels like they have a claim on anybody. Nothing is sacred. No boundaries are sacred. Not private property boundaries, not national boundaries, not boundaries of identity, not boundaries of family. And in the worst case, you get like incest, all this, like in the kind of like the bottom of it all, you get really messed up cultures. I write about the abolition of boundaries and bring back boundaries. That was a little political slogan we did. But that's the basic anthropological truth that, yes, in this very liberal society where people thought that we don't need sacred anymore, our desires should be the highest guiding principle, and there's no more sacred boundaries, and you just see like leakage, right? Identities are leaking across boundaries, including people's private property is just tip of the iceberg, right? A very important one. But I would say that disrespect for private property is part of the same phenomenon as the leakage of, let's say, sex identity, and the leakage of and the melting away of the borders between U.S. and Mexico, right? So there's just this idea that boundaries are not sacred anymore, and it does have to do. I would link it to that crisis of the Katechon. If we can't lift ourselves to the good Katechon, to the good sacrifice, we're gonna have to face either chaos or the violent Katechon, which is going to be some kind of violent, military conflict, civil war. I lived through one when I was a kid. I don't think these things are far away from any country. So that's what we're doing. We're
Yeah.
living in a crisis of Katechon, right?
Well, it seems like the more that we get away from the more the gospel infects the world. Habakkuk chapter 2 prophesies that the knowledge of the Lord will fill the earth as the ocean is filled with water. So it'll just be saturated. And I think we're undergoing what that looks like. Um, the knowledge of the Lord requires a certain obligation to maintain one's sanity when you encounter it, which is to repent of your sacrificial violence and repent of the envy, the covetousness that is also bound up in a society that manifests itself needing sacrificial violence to restore order. So you have to repent of both the personal mimetic desire of that leads you to personal social dysfunction, and then you also have to repent of the collective sin of society, which is its way of dealing with that, right, in the form of sacrificial violence. Both of those things have to be repented of. And I think what happens in our society is that we are losing our appetite for violence, but not to the same rate that we lose or we scapegoat differentiation itself, like you were talking about having healthy boundaries. In other words,
Yeah.
we are slower to repent of our violence than we are to try to castigate differentiation as the cause of violence. And here's where the nuance comes for me is that differentiation can be the occasion for sacrificial violence, but not necessarily so. And that nuance right there is all the difference in having civilization function or not. It's because the left is haunted and obsessed with eliminating all boundaries and differentiation. They hate the word no and they want to eliminate it. And the reason
Right.
why is because they implicitly, because they're very emotional and intuitive, they feel the Christ hauntedness more than other folks in society. They're kind of the tip of the spear of the emotion. They feel the vibe, in other words. And the vibe is one in which one is very skeptical about too much differentiation being maintained in certain categories, because in previous times in history, those differentiations were the occasion to select a sacrifice. So, for example, if you have everybody being relatively gender normal, and then you have someone who's a little bit of a gender undifferentiated person, in a sea of relative, everybody else is binary, and one person is a little bit non-binary, that would be an occasion to perhaps select that person for sacrifice. And I think that's why priests oftentimes had an androgynous appearance, right? Because they kind of represented the undifferentiated state in a manifested way. Like, this is a marked out place in which sacrifice is mediated. This person is kind of a monstrous double representation of the blending of those distinctions to a point in which it needs to be marked out as sacred and kind of marked out in a special place for sacrifice to happen. I think that, in other words, what I'm getting at is that the answer to the chaos that we see is for folks to actually change their priority. The left is more obsessed with hunting out, and the right too, because there's basically just a milder form of left. They're more obsessed with chasing out differentiation rather than repenting of the violence. And I think if we would learn to change that and say there are some forms of differentiation that are not moral in a Christian worldview, but there are others that are, right? In other words, what I'm saying is older forms of differentiation, for perhaps the Greeks, you could say, selecting a handicapped person to be the pharmakos. That is a unjust Christian. Like, from a Christian worldview, we can unjustly condemn that and say, why are you making a differentiation to say that someone who has a disfigurement or a handicap should be that much closer to the place of violence? How, by what standard should a Christian could say, absolutely not, right? The image of God is in this person, and we're going to elevate their status. Now, the left says, well, now we need to have sacrificial violence, to atone for the past power differentials between those who are considered to be handicapped and those who are considered to be healthy or whatever. And so that's where the balance is that the Christian must come, in my opinion, in the midst of this false dialectic between the left and the right, where the right says, let's just keep it the way it used to be. And that can't happen. That's an impossibility. And then the left says, well, let's just drive it off the cliff into nihilism and use absolute violence to get revenge. And the Christian says, no, we can't do either. We can't go back. We can't return to the Nietzschean worldview, and we can't drive it off of the cliff like the woke and have this vengeance-based, I call it revenge of the nerds Christianity. It's time for the nerds to get their revenge on the jocks in those 80s movies. That's the left. We gotta be able to answer both problems.
Yeah, no. I'll give an even more kind of general example. You're exactly right. There's this kind of what used to be violent in the past is not necessarily violent anymore. I would do the socioeconomic example, right? In the past, the rich were rich unfairly. Like, the feudal system, right? The rich lord lived in a castle, lived off of everybody's labor, confiscated half their money, and so on, right? So there's a ton of social injustice, right? Slavery. I mean, history is just a big record of human injustice. So it's nice that we've got behind that, right? But when you come with when we come to the modern times, like you're saying, they're kind of like doing a past. They're trying to avenge past things, but also there's this thing. I would say, like in the old times, there was scapegoating for sure. There still is. But when it came to these past injustices, right? When it came to, for example, socioeconomic injustice, right? You are born in this case, right, or this socioeconomic level, you can't escape it. You're born a peasant, you got to do peasant. You're born a blacksmith, you got to be a blacksmith. That was violent, essentially, and unfair, right? But because of the times were so violent, society was forced to have this kind of iron-fisted way of ordering things because they're afraid that if you just abolish those boundaries, even though they're violent, but if you abolish them, you're going to get even worse chaos. Now, thankfully, thanks for the influence of Christianity, we've moved to a less violent times and definitely a more free time, and that's a good thing, right? But now people think all rules are bad. Okay, they're saying like rules. Oh, look at past history. You had rules. You had the lords and the barons and the peasants. All that stuff is really bad. So we can't have these rules. Private property was evil, right? So we're gonna get rid of it completely. But when you get rid of it completely, you jump from the pan into the fire, right? Because yes, there was a lot of bad things, but it served a utilitarian purpose of keeping some semblance of order. Now we
Mhm.
can do better, but we can't get rid of the rules completely. We still need something because once you remove the
Yeah,
obstacle of the law, we get the obstacle of each other, right? We all want the same thing,
right.
and the society kind of goes nuts. So I think we're very similar kind of wavelength there on that progress of history. It's very nuanced,
Yeah,
and it's kind of giving this new, very modern, right? Very modern, unprecedented dilemma, and it's a good thing. It's a good problem to
yeah.
have.
Like the American dream is a Christian, like only Christianity could provide such a on paper fluid situation. You know, obviously it's mythologically overstated, but the idea that this guy came to America with $7 in his pocket and he became a multi-billionaire, those stories, that kind of fluidity up
Sure.
the hierarchy is something that only a Christ infected society could even imagine happening, right? And I think what I'm getting at is that my message to the left is having healthy boundaries is not inherently it's kind of my empathetic, you know, apologetic to the left is to say, look, what you're really after is that you are intuitively realizing that folks who are uh, kind of on the lower end of hierarchies of differentiation, they can be in situations they can be the target for sacrificial violence and marginalization. But the issue is to eliminate the acts the sacrificial violence, not the actual boundary of differentiation. And that's the question that I think folks need to wrestle with who are in this world of like the way we're looking at things, is that my question is, can you have boundaries of differentiation without the actual threat of sacrificial violence? Like I know what you were saying, that it's kind of violent to say that, like, if you're born a blacksmith, you have to stay there. But I'm not sure, like, I get that kind of use of the word violence, but I'm not sure if that's quite the same as the violence of actual sacrificial physical
Slavery.
coercion.
It's not. It's not the
Yeah,
same. Is
it's
it?
not the
Yeah,
same. Yeah,
not the same.
it's a
No.
kind of, what would you call that? Like a psychological violence or something, or a social
Yeah,
kind of,
limitation of
yeah,
freedom, so to
yeah.
speak, right? And it's something that a lot of people yearn to be taken away. And it's a good thing that's been taken away. What I'm saying is that it's a good thing we took away those old, both of those old kind of outs. It's a good thing, right? Now we're kind of given more freedom. But and it's a good thing, but they say with freedom comes responsibility. We're just faced with a new world, and that new world has new challenges. It's good to have these freedoms, but where I go back to always is this idea of once these kind of tight compartments that were kind of safe and restricted, but they're kind of safe, right? Once they're removed, great, you have freedom to move, but you're going to come into conflict with other people. Because the way I see this, for example, a lot of the liberal issues, like everybody wants the rich. I think a lot of the sort of, for example, like pursuit of insistence on equality and so on and redistribution, it just comes from a frustrated pursuit of wealth, really, and that comes from that abolition of boundaries. I write a lot about how um, instead of being fishes in a little like lake or an ocean that we used to be, now we're all instead of being like fishes in little ponds or whatever. Now we live in a globalized world without boundaries. Everybody has the same dreams, and the way I see it, actually, it's the competition, right? The rivalry and open competition in the United States and elsewhere. Maybe United States is the leader in that, right? Like you say, American dream. Again, it's a double-edged sword. It opens up these amazing uh, horizons of freedom, but
Yeah.
it also creates this psychologically intense rivalry that's unprecedented, and it's something we're trying
Yeah.
to learn how to handle. We never needed to handle that before. Because
Yeah.
yes, for your blacksmith, it's tight, restraining, but like you're happy blacksmith. You just once you kind of accept that, you
Yeah.
just live in a little world, you're good. That world's gone, right? So how do we deal with the new world? To me, that's what Gerard's a lot about.
Yeah, and we talk a lot about the blending of identity boundaries when it comes to gender, but one that I've been thinking about a lot more lately is class, right? Like a billionaire is not nearly as much of an external model as they used to be, because
No,
because
exactly,
of the
yeah,
advances of technology and social media. I remember watching back when Trump had Twitter, and he would
yeah,
tweet out in all caps when he was on a toilet or something at 3 a.m. These guys are coming after me, and he's in the White House. And then you
yeah,
would see Twitter's algorithm boost up all of his haters, at the top, and
yeah,
they'd say, "You loser, I hate you, you're going to jail," and all this stuff. And I thought, man, you can literally see the dissolution of the external mediating role of the
absolutely.
priest of the United States, this chief priest, the president role is literally losing its external mediation in real time because these little nobodies with an anonymous account can theoretically imagine that the most powerful man in the world who's typing in all caps just saw their nasty tweet reply to him. So they gotta, it's like having a dunk man tank where they're throwing the baseball at the dunk tank to try to make the guy fall in the water.
Yeah,
They get to
yeah,
have their
yeah,
shot at the chief priest tonight. Just
yeah,
maybe he'll read their nasty comment and he'll be hurt by that. And I thought, wow, what an example of an external mediating role becoming ever more internal, ever more closer to home, right? And that kind of competitive spirit where everything is within reach. And people often say, for example, that the average person who's relatively poor in America or wherever lives much, much beyond John D. Rockefeller's wildest imagination. That the technology, the access to foods and air
yeah,
conditioning and flight and all the information and all these different things. There's such a level of decadent abundance compared to what the richest man in the world could have imagined just 100 years ago or so. You can
right.
see the kind of the loss of the how poor people are increasingly in competition with the rich, and the rich are increasingly looking poor, and the poor are increasingly looking rich. Well, at the same time, the actual wealth gap is increasing. It's fascinating how that's it's
Yeah.
increasing, but yet they're more alike because of some of the other technological and social change that's happening.
Yeah, I mean, Twitter specifically. I mean, I remember that. I remember, I think Twitter was a big leap in that abolition of boundaries, and they're falling long before Twitter, right? But I'm old enough to remember when, like Twitter was this place where your celebrities were tweeting their day to day, and I think it just changed the culture and everybody's psyche forever. Because again, I'm old enough to remember in the 90s when people put posters of their celebrity and you
Yeah,
just imagine they're living some godly life, and that innocent world is gone,
yeah.
right, forever. So, yeah,
And
and
even
it's I
even in the 90s, the aura of cinema is broken when you can go to Blockbuster Video and get that amazing huge, you go into a dark room and a giant screen and you watch this big Hollywood production, and then to be able to take that in a tape form and put it on your TV, you're
yeah,
losing the external transcendence of a piece of film and cinema is now being brought into your own personal home and your own TV that you can touch, you can rewind, you can pause, and that's bringing those kind of mythological powers of art in that form closer and closer and closer into an undifferentiated state where I guess I could make a movie and I could put it on videotape and then it becomes
it's coming out.
yeah.
I mean, with
streaming.
the AI, you will literally be able, seems like you're gonna just be able to make like direct your own movie, just tell it what movie to make.
Yeah,
So
do you think
that's
that's
what
where I was thinking about that? Do you think the AI is going
yeah,
to get to the point where basically like the average Joe who has hardly any finances could literally like with CGI be able to create a blockbuster rendition, like on a
yeah,
level of some kind of a Marvel film or something, and do it for pennies because of the power of I mean that would be incredible
pretty
as to what
fascinating.
that would do for art. My God,
I think we're definitely going to see somebody do that, some
yeah,
disruption, you know. But I'm not that like into. I'm not, AI. I think it kind of eventually settles. The
yeah,
average Joe uses AI to make a blockbuster, but then think about what a really talented guy can do with the same thing, right?
right,
Anyway, but yes, the undifferentiation is just getting bigger and bigger, and the IT technology, right? Social media is the latest kind of crescendo in that. So it's no wonder. I mean, we're all on X, and Elon Musk purchased X, like he knows where it's at, right? So I think this social media phenomenon is just like central to everybody's life. I talked about it to my students. I mean, I think it's a very Girardian phenomenon, and who knows where it's going to take us, right? But it's kind of fascinating to watch.
yeah. So having um identified the IT as driving a lot of the undifferentiation, what do you think helps balance that out in a restraining sense?
You see a lot of the people going local kind of thing. My friend Charlie moved to a small town. You were just telling me you work on a farm. I don't think you necessarily need to move to the rural area, but just going local. I think a lot of people are doing that, realizing that, um, disconnecting from the big mimetic networks, because these big, when you have I always say, like, talking about celebrities and power, what creates these celebrities and crazy power pyramids is really desire, right? When we all obsess over one and the same person, it gives them power over us. A lot of times, real power, we give them their money. So if we want to reduce all those monsters and those giant pyramids of power and be more libertarian, we have to turn our attention away from them, right? You can be talk politics all day, right? But it's I think it's where your heart's at. Ultimately, if you all just didn't care that much, about whatever's tormenting us, and kind of focus more inward, and locally, whatever you pay attention to, whatever you gaze at, that's what grows in power in your eyes.
Yeah,
So I think it's going to have to be that, right? Um,
yeah,
Basically, right? You got to do your politics, but you don't want to do politics all the time, right? That's when you go crazy.
right, right. Yeah, that's an interesting thought. What you gaze at is what becomes more, and that's true. What you focus on, and
Yeah.
everybody keeps fixating on. I think the power of politics is the fascinating personas that people can vicariously live through. Trump
Yeah,
is a
yeah,
character that people can live into, and other Biden, all these characters people can slip into these people like a kind of an avatar and kind of experience these what I call lunchroom drama scandals back and forth. My guy's winning and I'm winning by him winning or him losing or I'm
yeah.
losing. And I think that's the power of politics, the ability to suck us all into that. And to the extent that people lose interest in that, I think its power will diminish, right?
Yes. And I think that to the extent that people lose interest at it, becomes more rational and less of a circus, right? Because you should vote, you got to vote and you got to elect your leader. But in the old days, when you didn't have TV, right? Let's say 19th century, it did seem to be kind of more rational, because people couldn't fascinate over their political leader as much. Maybe they could read about it in the newspaper and tell stories, but there just wasn't that amplification of technology that we have today. So people are concerned with their everyday, and when it came to electing their leaders, I think they're just kind of more practical about it, because they weren't idolizing them, like literally in a
Mm,
biblical sense. They were making idols out of them. So I think there's definitely that problem of heated heads getting heated up, and of course, resentment growing. So I think it all comes from emotions, not just in your head. Like if I obsess over somebody, they kind of grow in power in my head. But I'm saying also, if 10 million people obsess over somebody, that person literally becomes powerful because that person can get a dollar from each one of us, $10 right there. They're rich, they get money. So that's how all the popularity contexts work, including the political popularity context, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Well, that was my tweet. Um, the desires of many create the privilege of the few, you know. I'm kind of proud of that, right? So that's kind of my go-to principle of analyzing a lot of stuff because people complain about the rich, for example, billionaires. I mean, what makes people billionaire in a market? The fact that everybody buys their product. I mean, yes, there's practical value to it, but really, how do you get that, how do you get everybody to buy a Tesla? You got to create that aura, that mimetic attraction, right? So it's really Elon Musk creating desire, fostering desire in
yeah.
so many millions of people that gives him this power. And I'm not saying that's necessarily bad, but I just think that's how it works,
Do you
right?
think
So what,
a turn to the local and regional would be a reactionary throwback or a progressive kind of move in that sense? Does that make sense? And do you think?
No, I got you. I got you. It can be both, and I think it is being both. I would say
Mhm.
reactionary way is a bad way to doing it. If by that you mean, people want to go to the trad life and go back to some kind of 19th century Morris. We already discussed this. There's no going back to 19th century, right? 19th century was an unfair century where you had class oppression, all that. We can't go back, so I think that's a bad thing to do. It is a reaction, like it's a dealing with a problem, but go local, but do it the 21st century way, right? React to your issues. I don't think idolizing the past is going to work really.
Right. Tell us a little bit about your latest book and what you've been working on in general at your Substack.
So my latest book came out a few months ago and available on Amazon, Apple, wherever your platform is. It's called The Modern Malaise. It's written with my friend Virgil. We have a kind of conversation thing going on and some emulation of things hidden, And The Modern Malaise, the subtitle is A Girardian Treatise on the Culture War. So the idea for the book started off, he actually wanted to critique the new right, the Nietzscheans, because Virgil used to be into them, but then they were not very Christian. He was conflicted about the pagan and violent elements of that. So he asked me, because I also used to read Nietzsche and I'm pretty familiar with him. So he asked me to kind of critique these kind of pagan new right from a Girardian perspective. And about half the book is that. And then the other half is also doing the woke. And a lot of the ideas I touched upon that we talked about are already in the book, but I think the book tries to kind of do the whole art, like a treatise, kind of give you the big picture. We touch on the Nietzscheans, we touch on pickup artists, we touch on money hustlers. I have a section called homosexuality is a humiliation fetish, where I also do the gender identity thing as a leakage of boundaries. Um, and what is it on later? Yeah, all of these things. So it's just kind of an attempt to do like a map, let's say a Girardian map of this little culture war, especially as you see it on Twitter.
Yeah.
So the modern malaise, George Boreas, that's the
Well,
that's the big book.
very good. And where can people find your Substack?
Boreas, Substack.com, free subscription. A lot of it is free subscription. Um, my podcast, usually weekly, is available on all the major platforms, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, whichever. And I do have some old content on georgeboreas.com, but Substack, boreassubstack.com is where I post my latest stuff, and you can subscribe to the uh, mail, to the newsletter.
Very good. Any final thoughts or anything you wanted to say that you wanted to conclude with?
No, thank you for having me, David. I've been following you for a while. I 100% support your work. Keep it up. I hope we stay in touch and
Yeah,
exchange some more ideas and get this thing, like you said, get the word spread out, right? And make some change.
I
The
appreciate your
world needs
time.
it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
And of course, you can email us hello at a neighbor's choice.com. That's hello at a neighbor's choice.com. You can also follow me at David Gornoski on Twitter. And we will talk again soon. Godspeed.